Ultimately, there's two classifications for what I would call the crisis in transition or the testing of the country. We've all heard the euphemism after every presidential election that there is ultimately a testing of the new president or a testing of, in this particular case, a returning president like President Trump. In this instance, you either get the testing coming from the prior administration, an internal testing, right, where they set the table, they either make a mess of the geopolitical situation, or they put it in a different direction of that geopolitical situation that they know the inbound president's going into, or you have external forces that apply pressure. One of the first examples of this comes down to, I would like to say, the transition between President John Adams and President Jefferson. Some of us don't remember that long ago, but in 1797, we had a little thing called the XYZ Affair. The XYZ Affair actually defined a lot of the early portions of the country. And there's tons of parallels that exist that you could actually extrapolate from to today. Ultimately, the XYZ Affair, bottom line up front, was that the French were upset with the United States for having a particular treaty with the British. And as a result, started absconding with, capturing, and holding ships, U.S. trade ships, that we were delivering to Britain at the time, even though we were technically allied with France. So France was holding these ships, and as a result, President John Adams, right before the transition period to President Jefferson, ended up sending diplomats over to France to be able to negotiate the release of these ships. Ultimately, that negotiation was met with a lot of grift and corruption, in so much as the French diplomats stated to them, we're going to need $250,000 before we even begin to speak with you per person. When Adams was questioned by Congress about this, he refused to name the actual French foreign ministers that were demanding this money and referred to them only as X, Y, and Z. Thus began the term the XYZ Affair. Ultimately, what this did was fractured Adams's party, the Federalist Party, and ultimately gave strength to Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans. That fracturing in the Adams Party led to the phrase that there would be millions for defense, but not a cent for tribute. And this extended throughout the entirety of the country at the time. Ultimately, that political polarization led to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the increase of the Federalist powers at the time, and then the subsequent backlash to that Federalist powers as they were trying to censor essentially the population upset with this bribery that was taking place, and a public opinion shift that was at one point very aggressively interventionist towards the French, but then ultimately peeled itself back to be a little bit more, not isolationist, but less warlike interventionist for the Jefferson administration. What's really interesting about this is that it's internal strife between what took place from the prior administration, the Federalists, to the future administration of Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, was that the Democratic Republicans were often very French friendly. They were Francophiles. Remember, after all, Jefferson served as a dignitary and diplomat within France for many of the Revolutionary War years. And as a result, it really hampered his ability for his administration to be able to govern effectively in dealing with the French because of the XYZ affair that took place in the prior administration. But it's not just internal strife that happens, it's also external. Sometimes external forces want to test the presidency before that current president comes in. In this particular case, one excellent example of that has to do with the Tet Offensive, right? Where the Tet Offensive, knowing for the transition period prior to Lyndon B. Johnson being able to transition to power, took place in January to March of 1968. Ultimately, the Tet Offensive led to Johnson actually stepping down from the presidency at the time, and ultimately led to then the tumult that took place in 1968, and inevitably the election of President Nixon there. So external forces playing that factor. Ultimately, though, there's still internal forces that take place after the fact. You had the Somali incursions with George H.W. Bush. At the time, George H.W. Bush, prior to his transition to Clinton, decided that we wanted to provide humanitarian efforts into Somalia. Humanitarian efforts that likely included 28,000 Marines that got sent to the Horn of Africa to, quote, provide God's work and demonstrate food, assistance, and other different aid to increase that military footprint in Somalia. In this case, 28,000 Marines were essentially used as a significant military presence at all the key distribution areas. This then evolved from that, where we called mission creep, the term we all know very well, from humanitarian mission to an actually war-facing mission. And ultimately, all the necessary means to deliver humanitarian aid included physical force against the targets of the time. Now, this transition between H.W. Bush to Clinton ultimately led to what we know now as the Black Hawk Down incidences that took place in Somalia. But that was, again, a geopolitical decision from a prior administration that was then handed over to a future administration that was then delivered that complex situation. And perhaps one of my favorites, though, stepping back in time a little bit, has to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Eisenhower's transition to Kennedy ultimately led. There was everybody knows that the Bay of Pigs happening under the Kennedy administration. However, in March of 1960, prior to Kennedy taking over and winning the election, Eisenhower had already laid the groundwork for the Cuban Missile Crisis to include training of Cubans inside Florida at the time to be able to learn to take over what it looked like for that country. And then ultimately the different mission sets that they were working with his chief of staff, the secret mission sets they were working on, and the brigades they were training of Cubans to be able to conduct the Bay of Pigs. Finally, what's in the recent era? Okay, we've talked about everything from Adams to Jefferson to Lincoln to Buchanan to Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson and then to George H.W. Bush and Clinton. But Obama to Trump 1 also had significant repercussions for one administration's geopolitical effects, i.e., the arming of moderate rebels in Syria, known as Timber Sycamore, into Syria at the time, and then led that geopolitical decisions made in one administration to the next administration, the Trump 1 administration, to be able to deal with that issue. And interestingly enough, as you can all imagine, this has now raised its ugly head again. And the Syrian crisis, though with a little different flavoring, is back on the menu.